Can a US corporation operate as a non-resident corporation in Canada? Short answer, yes. A US corporation can operate in Canada as a non-resident corporation instead of forming a Canadian company. The real questions are what that means in practice, which registrations are still required, and when the Canada-US tax treaty and Canadian carrying on business rules pull you into the full Canadian tax system anyway. In Canadian law, a corporation is generally considered resident where it is incorporated or where its central management and control are exercised. A corporation incorporated in the United States and managed from there will usually be treated as non-resident for Canadian income tax purposes. That non-resident status does not prevent it from doing business in Canada, it just shapes how Canada taxes the resulting income. Non-resident corporations carrying on business in Canada. Canada taxes non-resident corporations on Canadian source income, including business profits earned from carrying on business in Canada. A non-resident corporation that carries on business in Canada must obtain a Canadian business number and open relevant CRA accounts, including an income tax account, and, if registration is required, a GST/HST account. In other words, you do not have to become a Canadian corporation to fall into the Canadian tax system. If your US company's activities in Canada cross the carrying on business line, Canada will treat you as having Canadian filing obligations even while you remain non-resident. Permanent establishment and the Canada-US Treaty. The Canada-US tax treaty overlays an extra filter on top of domestic law. Under the treaty, Canada only taxes the business profits of a US resident corporation to the extent those profits are attributable to a permanent establishment in Canada. A permanent establishment is generally a fixed place of business, such as an office, branch, factory, or workshop, or a deemed permanent establishment created by certain service activities or construction projects. So you can have a non-resident US corporation that is carrying on business in Canada from a Canadian perspective, but under the treaty, its profits are only taxable in Canada once that business is conducted through a Canadian permanent establishment. Until that point, you may have reporting obligations, but no actual income tax payable in Canada. Branch tax and filing obligations. Once a US corporation has a Canadian permanent establishment, Canada taxes the business profits attributable to that establishment on a net basis and can also impose a branch profits tax when those profits are effectively repatriated to the United States. The branch profits tax is conceptually similar to dividend withholding from a subsidiary, but applied to a non-residence branch. Treaty provisions generally reduce the branch tax rate compared to domestic law. Practically, that means a non-resident US corporation operating in Canada through a branch must file Canadian corporate income tax returns, keep branch-specific books and records, and track which profits are attributable to Canadian activities. The head office remains in the United States, but the Canadian branch is very real for tax purposes. GST, HST, and indirect tax registration. Income tax and GST, HST are separate systems. Even before you have a permanent establishment, you may be required to register for GST, HST if you are considered to be carrying on business in Canada and your Canadian-connected taxable supplies exceed the small supplier threshold. In that case, your US corporation registers as a non-resident business for GST, HST under its own name. You charge GST, HST on taxable Canadian supplies and claim input tax credits on eligible expenses. None of this requires you to incorporate in Canada. It just requires you to accept that. For GST, HST, Canada treats your US corporation as an active registrant. Corporate law and extra-provincial registration. Beyond tax, Canadian corporate and securities laws expect a foreign corporation that is carrying on business in a province to complete extra-provincial registration in that province. That registration essentially licenses your US corporation to operate in the province, to own or lease property, enter contracts, and be recognized in the public corporate registry. You remain a non-resident corporation, but you have a formal legal presence in the province where you register. This is one of the reasons the non-resident corporation label can be confusing. You may be non-resident for Canadian income tax purposes, yet locally registered in one or more provinces and fully visible to regulators and courts. When operating as a non-resident corporation makes sense. Continuing as a non-resident U.S. corporation in Canada can make sense where you are comfortable with direct parent-level liability for Canadian operations and where you do not need the branding or structural benefits of a separate Canadian corporation. It is logistically simpler than managing a whole new company, and it can be appropriate for limited scope projects, branches closely tied to head office, or situations where you expect a short-term presence in Canada. As your Canadian operations scale and become more permanent, you may find that the balance tilts toward forming a Canadian subsidiary to ring-fence risk and simplify local dealings, even though the tax base, Canadian profits on a net basis, may look similar under both models. Final thoughts. A U.S. corporation absolutely can operate as a non-resident corporation in Canada. The real issue is not whether it is allowed, but what tax, registration, and liability consequences follow once you are clearly carrying on business and possibly have a permanent establishment in Canada. If you are weighing branch-style operations against forming a Canadian company, it is worth mapping your expected footprint, treaty position, and provincial registration requirements before Canadian revenue takes off. Our website offers more detailed guides that walk through those questions step by step. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.